Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to completely break down the massive sociological concepts of gender and family. Seriously, from the clothes we literally just buy without thinking to the chores we do at home, we're taking textbook sociological theory and turning it into clear, relatable reality. We'll look at how these concepts shape our everyday lives, from the exact moment we're born all the way up to the macro-level structures of the global economy.
Okay, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with defining gender and identity, move into the process of socialization, look at navigating adulthood and family, and wrap up with global inequality and change.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Defining Gender and Identity.
So, at the very core of this whole topic is gender identity. Basically, this is the most personal way we see ourselves, right? Sociologically, gender is increasingly viewed as a wide spectrum, not just a strict binary of male and female. While a lot of people are cisgender, meaning, their personal identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth, others identify as transgender or non-binary, where that identity differs from their assigned sex. To put that into perspective, data from the Pew Research Center notes that roughly 4.3% of LGBTQ respondents identify as transgender, while demographers estimate it's about 0.15% of the general adult population. And we're seeing much more visibility for these diverse identities lately, thanks to mainstream shows like Orange is the New Black.
Now, it's absolutely crucial to separate gender, biological sex, and sexual orientation. They're basically separate puzzle pieces. Your demeanor or role behavior simply doesn't dictate your sexual preference. And honestly, studying gender isn't just about studying women. It literally involves all of us. When we look through the lens of intersectionality, which is the idea that our different social categories like race, class, and gender overlap to create unique systems of disadvantage, we're reminded that not all men, or all women for that matter, experience gender exactly the same way. Our race, our class, and other statuses deeply affect our lived reality.
Zooming out globally, we see that gender is highly culturally variable. The strict gender binary, it's actually not universal at all. For example, outside the US, we see entirely distinct third and fourth gender categories. In India, you have the Hijras, who occupy these specific ceremonial and ritual roles. Among Native Americans, two spirits incorporate both male and female aspects. In fact, anthropologists like Margaret Mead have been documenting for a long time how our ideas of gender shift dramatically from one culture to another.
But despite those global variations, societies, including ours, often fall into what psychologist Sandra Byrne calls gender polarization. Basically, this means we stereotype males with instrumental, action-oriented traits and females with expressive, nurturing traits, and we falsely assume they are complete opposites. When we do this, we're totally ignoring the fact that men and women are actually way more alike than different. Humans are highly capable of androgyny, meaning we can embody both sets of traits at the exact same time.
Moving right along to Section 2, the process of socialization.
So, how do we actually learn gender? Well, it happens primarily in two ways. First up is social learning theory. This is where we absorb attitudes through interaction, like modeling our parents and experiencing direct consequences for our behavior. The second is cognitive development theory, which was pioneered by thinkers like Piaget and Kohlberg. This one argues that our learning is based on our active, age-based interpretation of the environment around us. We're actively trying to figure it out as we grow.
Tracing this development over time reveals a really fascinating timeline. Believe it or not, socialization actually begins before you're even born. Think about parents throwing gender reveal parties and shaping the physical environment. By age 2, toddlers can already actively identify boys and girls. And then, around age 6 or 7, kids hit this massive cognitive milestone where they realize gender is a permanent trait. Once that clicks, they actively strive to attain the goals and displays of their specific gender.
Obviously, parents are our first models. They teach us through really subtle processes, like channeling our interest towards certain toys or exposing us to specific activities. Sociologists have actually found that parents generally fall into one of 5 patterns. You've got naturalizers who see gender as pure biology, then cultivators who view it largely as a social construct. Refiners sit somewhere in the middle, seeing a mix of biology and social learning, and then there are innovators and resistors who actively push back against these structures. Although, resistors might still worry a bit about their kids fitting in with their peers.
But hey, parents aren't the only ones running the show here. Schools have subtly gendered curriculums and teacher expectations. Mass media intensely bombards us with stereotypes, like emphasizing female thinness or male aggression. But at the same time, it's also fostering LGBTQ+ acceptance with mainstream shows like Modern Family.
And we absolutely cannot forget our peers. Friends and classmates aggressively police our roles through what sociologists actually call border work, maintaining super strict boundaries between what's considered acceptable for boys versus girls. Which brings us to Section 3, Navigating Adulthood and Family.
So what happens when we grow up? How do all those early gender expectations clash with the very real, very heavy adult responsibilities of college, marriage, parenting, and the modern workplace? Well, as it turns out, the transition into adulthood reveals some pretty massive gaps between what we were taught as kids and what we actually experience in the real world.
If you're a parent, you are probably going to recognize this psychological tug-of-war. When it comes to starting a family, cultural expectations impose incredibly high, sometimes impossible standards on women. It creates this constant friction between intensive mothering, which is this ideology arguing that kids require full-time, unconditional mothering, and extensive mothering. Extensive mothering is much more common with employed moms. It involves delegating the daily care to others, but still feeling ultimately responsible for the child's well-being. It's a really tough balancing act.
And that dynamic carries right into the division of household labor. Get this, recent data reveals that in 41% of families, women are either the sole or dominant wage earner. But despite making that massive economic contribution, they often face a really frustrating reality at home. They end up tackling a heavy second shift of disproportionate domestic duties and chores right on top of their full-time jobs.
All right, let's zoom out for our final section, Section 4, Global Inequality and Change.
Globally, male dominance, or patriarchy, is unfortunately commonplace, and it literally affects who gets to be born. This is grimly highlighted by sex selection and skewed birth ratio statistics. To put a number on it, in China, about 112 boys are born for every 100 girls. That is a direct result of discrimination that strongly favors male offspring.
These extreme structural inequalities show up in some really severe ways worldwide. Beyond sex selection, the United Nations estimates that up to 5,000 women and girls are victims of honor killings every single year. We also see brutal control over female autonomy through forced child marriages, as well as female circumcision and genital mutilation, practices that organizations like the WHO are actively working to deter.
But, inequality isn't just isolated to developing nations. Even in more egalitarian-leaning societies like the US, parity is severely lacking in the halls of power. Think about it for a second. As of recent data, no woman has ever been elected president. Women make up only about a quarter of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. They hold just 27 mayoralties in the top 100 cities and serve as governors in only 9 out of 50 states. That's a huge gap. And economically, we're still looking at a persistent wage gap between male and female earning capacity. When we look at corporate leadership, the disparity is stark. Out of the Fortune 500 companies, as of recent data, only 33 are led by women. Let that sink in. That is a mere 7%.
To combat these deep structural inequalities, collective action has birthed multiple social movements. Sociologists generally break these down into 3 branches. First, gender reform feminism, which focuses on equal rights and opportunities within the current system. Then you've got gender-resistant feminism. They advocate for more radical, separatist strategies, basically arguing that subordination is just way too deeply embedded in society to simply be reformed. And finally, gender rebellion feminism takes an intersectional approach, focusing on the interrelated, overlapping inequalities of gender, race, sexual orientation, and class. Now, men are an active part of this changing landscape too, bringing some real hope for a more balanced future. Pro-feminist men's organizations, like NOMAS, the National Organization for Men Against Sexism, are actively pushing for fairness. At the same time, we're seeing the traditional male role of sole breadwinner totally shifting. Men are increasingly engaging in nurturing activities, redefining what fatherhood looks like, and navigating the totally reasonable expectation that they be emotionally present partners rather than just financial providers.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer today. We've seen how deeply gender impacts every single stage of our lives, literally from the colored toys we're handed as toddlers, to the division of labor in our homes, all the way up to the massive systems of the global economy. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. As contemporary roles remain in a state of flux, are we actively reshaping these deeply ingrained societal roles, or are we ultimately just repeating the exact same patterns we were taught? Keep that in mind as you look at the world around you. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.